I always find these photos interesting, probably from the 1800s. What we see here are the Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia, and we know they lived and inhabited various parts of Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, the Gaspé Peninsula, New Brunswick, and all the way down to Penobscot. And the Algonquin people, nation, spread out much further than that. It just is part of my theme to focus in on the Mi'kmaq and their legends, what are known as the oral tradition, stories and tales that have been passed down to our day over thousands of years of time. And in my last video, the last couple of videos, matter of fact, I talked about Glooscap and his claimed brother Malcolm. Sometimes when you're reading these legends, these stories that were recorded back in the 1800s, the writers were writing down what they thought they were hearing from the Mi'kmaq. And sometimes they'd even put their own English or French words in there that didn't really describe what they were really trying to say at times. So this created a corruption, as they call it, in these legends. And that's why it's hard to read them sometimes, and the names of place names and what have you. So with that in view, what we got to do is glean the truth out of these stories and tales. And many of them, like in the case of Glooscap and Malcolm, and in the case of Glooscap and Martin. And I'm going to talk a bit about Glooscap and Winpi a bit later. But these two, Martin and Malcolm, with Glooscap, I'm confident those were constellation stories, even though Glooscap was a real person in the mind and hearts of the Mi'kmaq. So I'm not taking anything away from their views and beliefs. It's just that I'm trying to put some information out there of the knowledge that the Mi'kmaq had of the stars above their heads. And as I explained, they could even tell the difference with the naked eye in the color of various stars. And these stars represented birds that are of different colors. The constellation stories are very interesting. But worldwide, when we think about it, the ancient Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks, and other peoples of the world and other South America, and there was all kinds of information that they knew about the stars and the constellations in the night sky. And some of these were worked into words and poems and stories in a mathematical method. And so now what we're going to do, I'm going to take you to a short clip. John Anthony West, a lot of people know about him. And he's going to tell us a little story that I find very interesting. And so we'll take a few seconds here. I'll just bring that up. And there we go.
Clear in the new sub-science or sub-discipline of archaeoastronomy that sophisticated astronomical knowledge existed in very, very ancient times, beginning with a book called Hamlet's Mill, published in 1968 by MIT historians of science Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deckhand. It was found that extremely sophisticated astronomy was coded into the mythologies and legends of very ancient peoples. Perhaps most significant is that the ancients recognized and employed what is called the precession of the equinoxes in their myths, in their legends, and in their constructions. In the hands of Thomas Brophy, physicist and archaeoastronomer, we see that Nocta Playa is not just oriented to the solstices, which would already tell us that there was a fairly sophisticated astronomy in place, but rather that it encodes astronomical information so sophisticated that it's only in the past couple of decades that our own astronomy has been able to provide us with this kind of information. These crude stones.
So that was one interview. Now I'm going to take you to another one by Graham Hancock, just another short clip, and he's focusing in on the Egyptians and the pyramids, and of course he has lots of claims that I'm not going to go into at this moment, but I find his story here interesting, and I find it just as interesting as when I read these ancient stories and tales, oral tradition of the Mi'kmaq. I see a high level of intelligence used in these legends, and I'm sure they were very much aware of going out at night and studying the stars, possibly even on the level of the Egyptians if we want to push it to that limit, but this has to be looked at under the context of the environment. And the Mi'kmaq people live with nature, the rivers, the brooks, the mountains, and the hills. So their decipherment of the constellations would be in relationship to what's around them, the animals, the rivers, and the animals became like people in a sense. The bear, the beaver, the moose, and of course there's all kinds of names for various constellations, animal names. So why is there a big difference if we talk about one nation, the Greeks or the Romans, and we say, wow, they have all kinds of names for the constellations, and then we look at the Mi'kmaq, why not feel the same way? Stand back with a bit of awe and appreciation for the knowledge that they had prior to 1492, and onward too, of course, after that. It just didn't disappear in one day. But we get away from this kind of thinking because we're in the modern age of technology, computers, and we're not out in nature the way maybe we'd like to be or used to be. And those that are out in nature do appreciate the night skies and see in the real world around them, such as the Mi'kmaq did thousands of years ago. In Nova Scotia in particular, because that's my home province, and I focus on that maybe a little more than other areas, only because I lived there and grew up there, and I know that area inside and out, that part of the country. Even though I'm living in Austria, as mentioned a few times before, I still, have a great connection with my home country for that very reason.
The prime meridian at Greenwich is measured with the latest modern techniques, and beside the meridian line there stands a meridian building, which is oriented north, south, east, and west. The interesting thing about this building, although it incorporates all the latest knowledge, is that it is in fact 9/60ths of a degree off true north. And that's about the best we can do with our culture. If you go to Egypt and go to the Great Pyramid, which is not just any little building, which is a 6 million ton building, and which is at the very least 4,500 years old, and perhaps much older, you find that it is just 3/60ths of a degree off true north. Now what this tells us is that the people who built the Great Pyramid were people with advanced scientific knowledge, with the ability to express that knowledge with incredible precision in the most remarkable monument that has ever been built on the face of this earth. We're told by Egyptologists that that monument, perfectly oriented due north, south, east, and west, was built simply to satisfy the ego of some pharaoh of the 4th dynasty as his tomb. Everything about the monument proclaims the opposite conclusion, that it could never have been a tomb, and that whatever its purpose and function is, it was not to satisfy the ego of an individual pharaoh whose name is not even inscribed upon it in any place. This is a work of science and intelligence left for future generations to puzzle out. Not only is it perfectly oriented to the north, it also stands on latitude 30, exactly 1/3 of the way between the North Pole and the equator. Again, the Egyptologists would like us to believe that this is the result of coincidence. I think this defies common sense, and more people are unwilling to accept such an idea about the Great Pyramid. If it stands on latitude 30, then it does so because its builders deliberately put it there. For several hundred years.
So there we have it. Graham Hancock talking about the Great Pyramids of Giza. Now I do realize a lot of people up through the years are always trying to make connections with the Egyptians coming to North America, possibly connections with the Mi'kmaq. I'm not here today to prove or disprove that view. I might review it at another time. But one thing I do know is that the legend, the oral tradition of Winpi and Glooscap has a comparison in the night sky almost identical to that of the Ra ship Afterlife going down the Milky Way. That was Egyptian basic wording of their concept of the afterlife in the night sky and the stars and the constellations, and in particular the river, the Milky Way. And the Mi'kmaq had Glooscap and his family, Martin, his grandmother, and Glooscap's dog in a canoe going down the Milky Way. Now I may not touch on it a lot today, but in another video I might go into more detail. So once again, this is just a comparison. It's so interesting when we think of the huge globe around us, planet Earth, that we have these very interesting methods of thinking. So it tells me there's a mathematical way of looking around the universe. So regardless of what language we are speaking or what country we're from, math can be shared by all people and deciphered in the same manner. And like they say, it's in the math. Math proves itself. So that's why I put this up, John West here and Graham Hancock, to show you their side of the story. Now we're going to go and take a look at what's referred to as a stone carving or a tracing of one that was discovered years ago in the Kwemoo Lake area. Oh, it's just going to take a little second here to get this down. We'll bring this up, and everything takes time. So what you're looking at here is a tracing of a stone carving that was discovered in the Kwemoo Lake area of Nova Scotia in 1888 by a man by the name of George Creed. He was a postmaster at South Rawdon. He went in there with his family, and over a period, I think it all started in 1881, and friends, and they traced every stone carving they could find. And these are known as petroglyphs, and many of them, and not most, were carved by the Mi'kmaq, and dating 400 or 500 years old, some of them. Other carvings were carved by visitors, the English, the French, maybe the Portuguese. I even found some that looked like they're carved by the Egyptians with Berber script in them. Of course, this is all very controversial as soon as you start bringing in names of people that might have been in Nova Scotia before 1492. We may talk about that at another time, those possibilities, but I'm not saying everything has to be a fact, but we can review it as a possibility, something that's plausible. But at this point in time, we're looking at these various carvings. And now this collection of at least several hundred tracings like this one, and this one is known as Glooscap and Winpi. It's not the full tracing. There's a lower part that's like going down a mountain slope and there's rocks at the bottom. I'm focusing in on the individual, the man that appears to be above that eagle rock is Winpi. He was an enemy of Glooscap, and the rock below shows what looks like an eagle, and you know, it makes me think of Eagle Rock, Eagle Nest in Bedford that we all know about. I believe there's 12 rocks there, so there's a mathematical number I'm not going to go into. There's writings up to the left-hand side, and then we have another block behind that. Once again, I may come back to this at a later time in another video, maybe to zero in and be a little more specific. The thing is, there's 3 or 4 stories about Glooscap and Winpi, tales, oral tradition, legends. And I would say this was one of the hardest ones of them all for me to get my mind around and understand what's going on here. And I believe the bottom line is it's a constellation story. And so at this point in time, let's see if I have a little something here to read. In the beginning, men were as animals. This is in the legends that were wrote down in the 1800s. It starts again. In old times, in the beginning of things, men were as animals and animals as men. How this was, no one knows. But it is told that all were at first men. As they gave themselves up to this and that desire, and to naught else, they became beasts. But before this came to pass, they could change to one or the other form. Yet even as men, there was always something which showed what they were. So I think we're looking at constellations of animals and that here. And people, the personalities of people were viewed by the Mi'kmaq as, you know, of a porcupine. If you get too close to it, it sticks its quills into you. Maybe there was a person that wasn't so desirable to be near because of that. Who knows? If it was a porcupine, there's other animals that were mentioned, the beaver, the moose, and what have you. Now, Glooscap lived on an island, and with him were many Indians with the names and natures of animals and birds, see? So it's calling people animals and birds with these names. The partridge, beaver, these were names that they give these people. But you'd have to visualize these also in the night sky as well, in the constellations. These men, but most of all, partridge, have acquired power themselves, became jealous of Glooscap, and made up their minds to depart when he was away, taking with them Martin. See, we have Martin here, not Melsom, and the grandmother. So the grandmother, in the European continent, it's like the old lady, a lady who tells tales and maybe lives by herself and is really old. And you'll see this appearing in different legends throughout North America too. There's always this elderly lady who would tell stories and tales and pass on the oral traditions. So that'd be the grandmother in this particular case. For they had great hope that Glooscap, being left alone on the island, I'd love to think of that being his Oak Island, but anyway, if it doesn't say it, all we can do is speculate and make conjectures which get us nowhere. But it's just sometimes I like to make a connection somehow with Oak Island, but I haven't done that so far directly that I can say it's beyond a reasonable doubt. Then the legend goes on, because they knew not his power. Then it stops there. Then there's another legend. And these legends about Winpi and Glooscap were indications that they went to Newfoundland. And the one place they left off was St. John, New Brunswick, in that harbour there. Another place was Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. They pulled away from there. Another legend says they left from Liverpool. So there's 3 different stories. And that's why it's so complicated. And that's why it's taken me so long to get my mind around it and understand. But once again, I believe it's a constellation story. It mentions here, there's another story which says that he, that's Glooscap, was living in the mouth of the St. John. There's a few Mi'kmaq names here that describe that area. and went away into the forest as far as Guan, or John, and had been gone 6 weeks. When he returned home and found the old woman, whose name was Muin, which is the the Big Dipper constellation, as we learned earlier in one of my videos. It's Muin or Moen. And Martin had been taken away. So Glooscap, in other words, took, or not Glooscap, but Winpi took Glooscap's family hostage on a boat and left from one of these harbors that were just mentioned, and he took them over to Newfoundland. And he kidnapped them. Following their tracks to the shore, he saw one of his greatest enemies, a terrible sorcerer named Winpi, just pushing off in his canoe, and with him were his wife and child and Dame Bear, which would be maybe the Little Dipper, because, you know, these have been likened to bears. So I'm just wondering if we can draw the line there. I guess we can read a bit further. It breaks into another legend, same story, but the third part. They were still within call, and Glooscap cried from the shore to the grandmother to send back his dogs, which were no longer than mice, and as some of the stories tell us, were squirrels. So she took, which was a small wooden platter, and on such Indian dice is tossed. This she put in the water and placed the dogs in it, and it floated to the shore, and Glooscap took it up. Winpi with his family and prisoners pushed off to, as other tales tell us, to Newfoundland. And then Glooscap chased them over there from Cape Breton to Newfoundland, and he finally caught up with Winpi, and the story indicates he killed him. Winpi was slain. We don't know who Winpi was, and so Glooscap freed his family. I will do a follow-up on this story at a later time. You know, it's interesting. I chat with various people when I put these videos on YouTube, and it's interesting how words sometimes, I didn't realize it fully, but Pandora's box. I always believed in a myth story behind that Pandora's box, as if if you open that box up, blessings would come out of it and people would feel good and all that. But actually it's just almost the reverse of that, the real true story behind it, which was mentioned to me. Then I looked into it. Pandora's box was never a box, but it was a jar. And unfortunately, a lot of not so good things came out of it. Today we would refer to Pandora's box as opening up a can of worms. So we open the can up, not so good, not so happy. But you know, I find sometimes when I look into legends and traditions and things like that, sometimes the can is open, it doesn't look so good at first. But you know, there's ways of piecing it back together that it can make sense and be a very interesting story. So I'm going to watch myself in the future, because when we say things what are called off the cuff, sometimes we don't give enough depth to what we're really saying or meaning. And so anyway, I just thought I'd mention that. I think we'll close our video now, and we'll just close it with this little short clip of a clock that I invented. A Mi'kmaq clock, I call it.